Well, good morning. Welcome to this first of two deep dive sessions in which we're going to look at two bits of focus of the Eminent Persons Group. And this one will talk a bit about how to make financing for development work more effectively. And then in the next session, we'll talk a bit about global financial markets, their interconnectedness, and how we create a safer framework for countries to manage their interactions with financial markets. So I'm going to start. You've already been told who the eminent panelists are. And I'd like to start perhaps with Nick. Nick, maybe what would be good if you could give us a little bit of a sense of what's the big message on the development agenda, why now, and how will this report help us to make progress?
We were asked how we would suggest the international financial system should be reformed, modernized for the challenges we face now, the challenges of the 21st century. So you have to begin by asking what are those challenges, and do that in the context of how the world has changed in the 70 years since the basic structures of the international financial institutions were put in place. Clearly one could go on for a long time, but headlines. The world is much more private sector than it was in the years after the Second World War. The world economy is much bigger. Actually, it's 12 times as big. Population's gone up by a factor of 3, and output per capita by a factor of 4. That has put enormous pressure on the global commons, particularly since that growth has been largely fossil fueled. The economic geography has changed dramatically, and different kinds of interactions and links, be they infrastructure and trade and so on, are in place. And of course, as Tarman just emphasized, the demographic changes have implied that a very large number of young people will be coming into the workforce in the coming years. So that's how the world has changed. How will it change? Output will double in the world at a growth rate of 3.1 or so % in the next 2 decades. The world's infrastructure will double in the next 15 years. What kind of infrastructure that is, it's not just the quantity, the quality of that infrastructure. It must be much more sustainable than has gone before, is absolutely fundamental. And I've already underlined the number of young people, as has Tarman, coming onto the labour market. Those are the challenges of the next 20 years. They are also 20 years in which the world's emissions have to come down by 25 or 30% in the context of these doublings if we're to have any chance of staying well below 2 degrees. And of course, the consequences of not doing that are potentially devastating. So we have to change the way we do things in the light of the challenges that I've described and in the light of the changes that have taken place in the past. That means that we have to ramp up investment, particularly investment in infrastructure, taking a very careful look at the quality of that infrastructure. We know that the private sector will have to play a very big part in the story, and we know that the private sector cannot do it alone. It needs the policies and institutions that shape, and the governance capacity that shape the investment climate. It needs institutions, particularly the MDBs, that can take the kinds of risk which it finds very difficult to take. So our report is designed to capture the challenge of the next 20 years, to respond to the challenge of the next 20 years by defining mechanisms that the MDBs, the multilateral development banks in particular, can bring to the table. So what are they? Well, we talk first about the policies, governance capacity that shape the investment climate that can drive the investment forward. The world is full of lots of investment ideas. The challenge and opportunities, the challenge is to translate those into real programs and projects. The investment climate is critical, and the governance is critical to that. That's the first element in our story. The second element in the story of ramping up are what we call country platforms, of course shaped by the country itself, defining what its investment programs should look like. what they have in mind for the infrastructure and the different kind of sectoral investments, so that the international institutions and the private sector can get behind those programs, understanding that there's some kind of sense of direction as to where they will go. That brings the kind of confidence that investment needs. But it also allows the international financial institutions to come behind those stories and platforms and plans in a coherent way. My great friend and colleague Ngozi will be saying more about what that means. It means finance on scale. As we ramp up the investments, you've got to ramp up the finance, and there you need the right kind of risk management. The presence of a multilateral development bank itself reduces risks, because governments are less likely to pay fast and loose if an MDB is in the deal. The MDBs have to be ready to take the difficult risks which the private sector can't take so easily. Early stage equity risk in infrastructure projects, for example. Political risk insurance. And it has to enable the scaling of this whole story to take place by selling on its assets, particularly once they've proved themselves, to release more capital for its own activities so it can ramp up itself, but also as a means of bringing in very large quantities of private sector potential investments through financial institutions, which find it difficult to do. They find it difficult to do that before those initial risks have been overcome. The ramping up and bringing in private sector investments, financial and otherwise, will be greatly enhanced by much more coherence in the standards and mechanisms and documentations that are used. So you can see we go through everything I've just said comes into one or more proposals in the report. I won't tell you precisely which numbers, but everything I've just described that can enable this ramping up is there in terms of specific proposals. And working together as a group is behind everything that I've just listed in these proposals. So we propose ideas as to how they can function better as a group. That's a key part of our story. So that's the broad motivation. Those are the kinds of things we have in mind to enable this crucial ramping up in these vital next 10, 20 years. And I've tried to tell it in a way where you should really listen, because there's big opportunities out there for the international world of international finance. We have to get on with this very quickly. We have to start implementing this thing in the next months, not the next several years. If the next decade is crucial, if the reform is crucial for the next decade, you better get about that reform quickly. So the implementation is absolutely crucial. And voices like yours to say, yes, we recognize the potential here. We could be investing much more, and those reforms will help us to do so. That kind of support would be in your interests and greatly appreciated by ourselves.
Thank you very much, Nick. So I think we'll come back to some of the issues you've raised about the different instruments and ways in which private sector can be more effectively now joined up in this process. But you mentioned the fact that one of the objectives is to try and come behind country platforms. And I want to get a little bit of a sense of sort of what that means in practice. And Ngozi, you've sort of been managing country platforms from various dimensions and sides in your career. And how do you see this country platform concept working? And perhaps you could also just say a word about, Tharman referred to the challenge that we have coming up in Africa. You know, larger number of young people coming on to the labor force than ever in the history of the world. And I think it'd be just good a little bit to get your sense of the urgency that we now face in Africa.
Well, thank you, Masood. Following on from what Tharman and Nick said, I just wanted to make one point first before going into the story about the instruments, and that is that in the success we've had in the 70 past years where, you know, productivity has risen, there's been convergence in incomes, you know, among countries in the globe, that's been a very good story. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. But in this story, some people have also been left behind within countries. And whole countries have also been left behind in this growth story. When you add that dimension to the challenges that Nick spoke about in terms of the climate threats that we face, the demographic challenges we face now, the possibilities of pandemics and other challenges the world is facing, you have a very complex and urgent story and a need to act. And nowhere are these complexities and challenges more than on the African continent. Just some numbers. Of the 600 million young people that will come onto the job market by 2030, 1 in 3 will be Africans. Of the 13 mega cities we expect by 2030, 3 of them, Lagos, Cairo, and Kinshasa, will be mega cities in Africa with all the urban challenges. When you look at the total number of poor people, by 2030, 87% will be on the African continent. So we are talking of very serious challenges that we need to confront. But we're also talking of important opportunities that are there. You look at the rise of technology, and you think of the fact that in a population of 1.2 billion on the continent, 750 million people own mobile phones, opening up large possibilities across financial inclusion, the use of technology in health, education, and various other aspects, even in agriculture, that will give us an opportunity to make a difference and lift the continent up. So Africa is where we have challenges, but Africa is also where we have very good opportunities to succeed. And there's one phrase we have in the report that I really like. It says, we say in the report, that to bend the arc of history, we must succeed in Africa. That's where the challenge lies. So those are just some numbers to set the scene and also to spike the interest that there is an opportunity to make a difference. Now, the world has agreed on a framework, and Nick alluded to it, for solving these problems. The framework of the Paris Climate Accord and the Sustainable Development Goals. But to make this framework work, we need to act differently, we need to act with urgency, and we need to act at scale. And that is why this report has recommended that we have to change the ways of working if we are going to succeed. First, countries and country policies matter. So countries also have to take their responsibility and put in place the kinds of policies that will enable a change. But secondly, we need the multilateral development banks and the international system to support these countries by working differently. Right now, we've got a system where the sum of the parts does not amount to an impactful whole. There's too much fragmentation in the system. You said, as a former finance minister, I saw the system working when I was finance minister of Nigeria from the countryside. And that meant, individual institutions all coming. We'll get over 100 missions a year from this multilateral bank, this bilateral donor, all of them acting separately, so that when you added up the impact, it didn't really deliver what the system was supposed to deliver. And that is why in this group we have recommended the use of country platforms. Of course, many of the institutions will say they're already using some element of country platforms, but that's not what we mean. We want to go deeper to country platforms that will unite all the multilateral system, collaborating to also bring the private sector on board. So you have countries, you have private sector, you have the multilateral systems, and eventually the bilaterals, working off of the same sets of standards and goals to deliver for a country. And some of the core standards that we think they should work around, some of them are already known, like environmental and social standards, but others are around core standards on debt sustainability, coherent pricing policies, procurement, local capacity building, transparency, and anti-corruption. If we have the system working around these standards, they can deliver better for countries and at a country level. So that's what we mean by country platform. Using the country platform, for instance, you can solve one of the problems that are perpetually facing the private sector and the multilaterals, the lack of bankable projects. Every time you talk to investors about investing in particular countries, they always talk about the money is there, but we don't have any bankable projects. Well, if we gathered around these country platforms, we could deliver better on that. Shareholders of these institutions have a particular role to play, because if they do not give the flexibility and the support, the multilaterals cannot come around to make the changes they make for these platforms to work. I also want to say that in some cases, we may even need to go to regional platforms. Why is that? If you take some parts of Africa, I think in West Africa, you cannot make a huge difference in some of the Sahelian countries unless they are also linked in the sub-region through infrastructure projects, and this will require regional or sub-regional infrastructure to come, hence the need for regional platforms. Just to make one more point, around the country I also feel that country and regional platforms cannot succeed unless you can use the multilateral banks to deliver the kind of financing that will be needed. And Nick started to allude to this. We need to have these MDBs de-risk not only projects, but also programs and even whole countries. This will enable the private sector to bring in the kind of financing that will be needed to deliver. You know, we have huge gaps. We have $6 trillion that is needed every year and for the next 15 years for infrastructure. And of this, we have a gap of over $1 trillion a year to fill. How is this going to be done? At the same time, we have pools of savings in the private sector that need to be mobilized to fill this gap. It is only by using these multilaterals as instruments to deliver the kinds of de-risking that will enable the money to come in that we can succeed. So this is another aspect of the picture.
Thank you very much, Ngozi. So I would just say that if you ask the people in this room, one of the sources of frustration, which I hope the country platforms will help to address, is that if you're in the private sector and you want to try and do a project with a multilateral development bank, the terms and conditions, the forms you have to fill out, the engagement approach varies from institution to institution to institution. And it makes it much more expensive and much harder for a private sector investor to partner with one or more of those institutions. And I hope that when we have the country platforms, one of the things that we'll be able to do is actually to have some homogenized, uniform model. And I see no reason why, when you apply to many colleges, you can use the same form for your daughter, but when you try and do a project, you have to do a different form for each bank. It just doesn't make sense. Yeah. But I want to come back to another core point which you raised, which is, if you do the country platforms, you really need to have the institutional and human capital in the countries to be able to make that work. And we've just been talking about countries in Africa, but not just in Africa, but elsewhere. There's variation in the skill set and human capital. So investing in human capital becomes a core part of the agenda to make this project work. And I want to get a little bit, Nora, your perspective on this. You know, how do you see that part of the puzzle falling into place to make this work?
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Masood, and hello, everyone. Human capital is key for growth, and we couldn't be at a more auspicious moment than this week to talk about human capital, because the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to one of the key thinkers about the role of human capital in determining growth, in particular through generating the technological change that's required for growth. And for those of you who have been attending other sessions here in the annual meetings, you might have heard that yesterday the World Bank launched the Human Capital Index, which is going to rank countries according to how far they are from the maximum potential they can obtain if a child gets fully educated and if complete round access to health, how do countries compare? And I want to take the opportunity to congratulate our chairman, Tharman, and his country, because he came out first in this ranking. The African countries, as you said, tend to be on the lower end, and that's where all the work needs to be done. A beauty about human capital, different from other forms of capital, is that in addition for being good for growth, it also generates well-being immediately, because being healthy, being well-nourished, having access to sanitation, and being educated and having the ability to understand the world produces well-being immediately. And at the same time, it's not only something that creates growth, well-being, but it's also good for equity. One of the best ways to actually generate more equality in a society is investing in human capital, in particular, narrowing the gaps that exist in human capital by investing fundamentally in those who have been left behind. So it's very important to give human capital prominence, and that's what our report does. It says in Proposal 1 in the development area that the efforts by the multilateral organizations should refocus on governance and human capital. And for that, the multilateral organizations are really well placed because they can help countries estimate the cost, find ways in which they can be financed, share with them what are the best practices in investing in human capital, finding ways in which you design progressive and efficient tax systems, curbing waste and corruption in the way you spend. And for all of that, the multilateral organizations need several things that we emphasize also in the proposals. For example, if you want to do things well, you need data and you need knowledge. So investing in data and research continues to be key. Policy-relevant research for the organizations continues to be key for the accomplishment of higher human capital. You also need a way to deploy using innovative systems and at the grassroots level what you want to the groups of society to achieve, and in that sense partnering with the business sector, philanthropies and NGOs can be key, and that's another one of the proposals that we have in our report. Thirdly, it needs much better coordination, because it's true that most of the multilaterals, the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, and the regional development banks are engaged in helping in all these areas, but they're acting independently and in a way that's not really capturing the synergies and externalities that combining their efforts can bring. And here's where the proposals of the country level and regional platforms, and Ngozi mentioned a little while ago, are key. And the same thing for the, thinking about the coordination mechanisms is there are many trust funds that are floating around in the multilateral organizations that deploy resources and bring in knowledge that probably could be put to much better use if they're integrated in these coordinated platforms. So those are all the proposals that we put in place for achieving higher human capital. However, as was said earlier, the amount of resources that we need to really close the gaps and get near what the Sustainable Development Goals have set out is immense. There's estimates floating around. In the report, we quote $1 trillion a year that the gap in infrastructure investment that's required, not just for the human capital, but also the physical capital that's needed for growth. The IMF just generated a new estimate about $500 million a year, or 14% on average of GDP would have the resources to be raised in the low-income countries. And the multilateral development banks do not have those resources. So where are they going to come from? You can't say they're going to come from the countries themselves. Some of them will, but domestic resource mobilization in low-income countries can go only a particular way. They're not going to be able to close the gap. Aid is another source, but aid also has its limits, and there's not a lot of taste for aid at this point to expect to be much more to be available to the developing world. Therefore, a lot will have to come from partnering, leveraging resources from the private sector. And that's why in large number of the proposals that are in the report try to address issues that have to do with the business model of the NDBs so that they can become much more effective in attracting resources from the private sector. And one last word, and this is going to be a bridge perhaps to the next session. We always talk about how to expand human capital. We also need to prevent it from actually falling. And it happens much more frequently than you think, and the costs are much worse than what affects physical capital, because many of those cases are not reversible. If a child is not well nourished at a particular age, so that investment doesn't occur, the effects of that malnourishment cannot be cannot be recovered by investing more in the child's nourishment later on in his life or her life. Therefore, preventing crises of all kinds and managing them in a way that you curb the nastiest effects of crisis is key for our human capital agenda, our growth agenda, and our social stability agenda. And that's where the bridge between the development and the financial proposals that we have in our report comes in.
Thank you very much, Nora. So we're got a few minutes left before we bring on the next panel. So I want to ask you all a somewhat more difficult question now, which is, so you consulted quite widely in coming up with these proposals. You've talked to the development banks, you've talked to the private sector, you've talked to governments, you've listened to civil society. And what I'm struck by is that, you know, what you've come up with is really, when you add it up, quite a sea change in the way in which the development cooperation machinery will work. So people come behind countries, development banks, instead of working individually and competing, work as a system. Instead of focusing on their own lending, they should be mobilizing lending from the private sector and catalyzing it. They should be reorienting their work on human capital development and governance, that the shareholders of the system, which is to say the countries, will provide strategic leadership to make all this happen. And I guess my question to you is, you've talked to all these people in coming up with these recommendations. How confident are you that they buy into these proposals? That would be my question. So Nick, you've got your hand up.
The first thing is that we're allegedly an eminent persons group, which means that there are very few very young people amongst our group. So we have been talking and thinking about these issues for some considerable time, not just the last year. But what we shared amongst ourselves was the very strong understanding how much the world has changed, how intense the challenges are of these next few years, next 10, 15 years, and how critical it was that the MDBs changed in response to that. So it's very important to appreciate where this understanding arises from. Now, I think that understanding of the challenges of the coming years is actually shared quite broadly. I mean, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they were put together agreed in 2015, by 190-something countries. So there was a joint recognition of how important it is that our development is sustainable. There's Sustainable Development Goals. Much more in there about inequality of all kinds, much more in there about the dysfunctionality of many cities, in our oceans and our forests, and it was a deeper understanding of the challenges of development, but it was broadly shared in that sense, and as embodied in that agenda. So I think that in some ways the understanding has moved in a way that the ground should be fertile. That doesn't mean it's easy, because individual development banks have their own stories to tell, their own strengths. They don't want other people telling them what to do. But they have shareholders, and they have very good people in those banks who understand many of these issues. So I'm reasonably optimistic, but it does mean mobilizing support. Because this is so important for the private sector, I hope that support comes from people like those in this room. It needs support from civil society. It needs support from the political system. And ultimately, it has to be driven by the major shareholders.
Thank you very much, Nick. Ngozi, are you optimistic in 1 minute?
In 1 minute?
Yes.
That's tough. I'm optimistic from a country point of view, not so much because we are eminent. I don't know what that means. I think, we just have a lot of experience. But because we've touched on issues which I think people in many of our countries care about. The fact that we're talking about people who have been left out, who have been marginalized by the process that has gone on with regard to development in the past 70 years, which has led to very populist and nationalistic policies in certain developed countries, for instance. The fact that we're talking about youth in our countries and the need to create the millions of jobs that they will need. The fact that we are talking about women and the need to include and empower them. All these things speak to issues that people live with daily. So I'm optimistic from the country point of view. The fact that we are talking about avoiding millions of missions to these countries, or thousands per year, and people coalescing together. We have a saying in my language, which is Igbo, that says, it means if the right hand washes the left and the left hand washes the right, both will become clean. We are talking about it in this report, which means collaboration. And people in our countries understand collaboration. So I'm very optimistic. What I'm not as optimistic is what the private sector will do.
All right, thank you. Nora, we're going to run out of time, so you have 10 seconds to say.
Well, no, I'm going to say that I am actually concerned about whether the report will be heard loud and clear, especially given that we have so many distractors in the world currently, and especially because the sentiment in many of the countries that have to be the leaders of the process is not necessarily congruent with what we're proposing. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, but it will require much more effort on the part of everybody that's interested in seeing this happening in terms of advocacy and investing in generating a movement, if you want, so that the commitments that we think have been done by all the countries in the UN when they adopted the Sustainable Development Goals are actually a reality. Time is up.
Thank you. So I just want to end by saying that, in a way, given the scale of the challenge and given the cost of not rising to meet that challenge, economic, social, political, over the next decade, frankly, I don't think we have any choice but to mobilize to try and make the system work differently. And that requires everybody, including all of the people sitting in this room. So thank you all for your contributions. Please join me in thanking our panelists.